Welcome to the first of this year's Saturday Scholars. I'm Peter Holland. I'm the Associate Dean for the Division of the Arts in the College of Arts and Letters. And for some years now, Arts and Letters has created this series because people can't tailgate all the time. And we thought it's a good moment to allow people the opportunity, I think a wonderful opportunity, to listen to some of our favorite, best, brightest, most exciting faculty talking about work that relates to their own research. I'll come back to Mark's topic in a bit, but let me just give you the rundown of the season, not in terms of the football season, though I could do that rundown as well. For the Michigan game, we will actually have a Saturday Scholars, but at 4 o'clock in the afternoon, because it's a night game. And David Hernandez, who is director of the Butrint Archaeological Research Project, is going to talk about the extraordinary discoveries that project has been doing in its archaeological excavations. Then for the Stanford game on the 13th of October, because it's rather close to a significant event that happens once every 4 years, Susan Omer from the Department of Film, Television and Theatre will be talking about presidential campaign commercials, from I Like Ike to today. On the 20th of October, Jessica Payne, who's an assistant professor in the Department of Psychology, is going to be talking about her research on sleep, stress and memory, under the title, Sleep on It, there's more to it than just the old adage. And at the Pittsburgh game, 3rd of November, Brad Gregori will be talking about the unintended Reformation, how a religious revolution secularized society. And the final lecture of our series for the final home game on the 17th of November will be given by Mark Roach, for years the dean of the college, and now finally, much to his delight, returned to normal faculty work. And he's researching humor at the moment, and so his title is, What's So Funny About a Joke? We always aim in the series to have one talk that is really about Notre Dame itself. And because of Mark Pilkinton's extraordinary research over the last few years, it seemed absolutely right that we invite Mark to give this lecture this year. He was chair of the Department of Film, Television and Theatre in its various names and incarnations from 1984 to 2003. In other words, it's his fault I'm here, because he was chair of my home department when I arrived at Notre Dame in 2002. He's directed 13 main stage productions, from Dario Fo's We Won't Pay, We Won't Pay in 1985 through to an extraordinary production of a very, very, very rarely performed play by Artaud called Spurt of Blood in 2008. He was the editor of the volume on the city of Bristol in one of the most extraordinary archival projects that I know about. It's called The Records of Early English Drama, and it's trying bit by bit, city by city, county by county, of uncovering all the records of performance across the medieval and early modern period. It is a major project that runs from Toronto, and Mark produced the amazing volume on everything that there is to know about performance in Bristol. For the last few years, he's been working on what's been going on in terms of theatre at Notre Dame, and he's editing the online theatre chronology for the Notre Dame archives. And of course, one of the results of that is that he is particularly knowledgeable about where performance was happening, and the place where performance happened for so long at Notre Dame was at Washington Hall. And it turned into a book, Washington Hall at Notre Dame, the crossroads of the university, charting what was going on in the construction and changing functions of Washington Hall between 1864 and 2004. And that book came out last year. He subtitled it Crossroads of the University. And I think for many of us, the center of the university is made up of those three buildings at the heart, the main building and the dome, the Basilica, and Washington Hall. And so he terminated it in 2004 at the point at which the department moved to the Performing Arts Centre, the de Bartolo Performing Arts Centre, which marks such a sea change in performance at Notre Dame. But the research hasn't stopped. It's gone on now to look a little further at the connections between Gregori, who was the painter who painted the murals that are so familiar in the main building, and who did work in Washington Hall as well. And Mark has new information about what he did do and what might still be there. So it's a great pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Mark Pilkinton.
Thank you so much, Peter, for that, all those kind words. He said he was getting the best and brightest and all that, and since we couldn't do that, he asked me to come instead today and talk with you. I think this Saturday Scholar Series has as its goal the bringing the latest scholarship to you and trying to reveal how that process actually works. And our work as scholars is ongoing. It never ends. We never finish. So in a very real sense, as soon as we publish something, we find there's always more to learn, in fact. I just lost. And certainly that is the case today. I'm going to talk about the process specifically with regard to new information that has come to light since my book, Washington Hall at Notre Dame, was published just a year ago. But first, let me give you just a bit of background on Washington Hall itself. I know everybody's from different backgrounds and has different knowledge, so let's just go over a little bit of that very quickly. As Peter said, Washington Hall, which is just, of course, just east of the main building, here's Washington Hall, has been, of course, a very busy place since its dedication in 1882, and nearly everyone who attended Notre Dame has some memory or recollection of it. It's with that triumvirate or that triad or that troika, if you will, of the main historical campus. We've got lots of try words to use with that, don't we? And here it is, a blow-up, a closer-up view of Washington Hall, which a lot of you know. Some recall attending orientation meetings when they first arrived, or convocations when they were about to graduate, and those getting married may have even taken Father Hesburgh's famous pre-Cana classes there, which he taught in that building for a long period of time. In fact, classes were taught there well into the 1980s and even early 1990s. I think we can say certainly that Notre Dame students have filled the auditorium. Many of you in here who are graduates probably can remember filling the auditorium to see your peers act in plays, to watch movies, to attend lectures, to take classes, examinations, and so forth, to experience music in all of its forms. And of course, we've also been there to hear the world's movers and shakers, from Tom Dooley to Mario Cuomo. This is a picture of Mario Cuomo's famous speech in the fall of 1984. We've heard these great movers and shakers speak from that Washington Hall stage. And of course, nearly everyone who remembers anything about Washington Hall, also has that ghost story to tell, and that's ranging from the building being haunted by an incorporeal bugle player. That's one of the big stories. Famed football star George Gipp, who, by the way, we don't think was ever called the Gipper in his lifetime, but that's another story for another time, who died of pneumonia in 1920, or a terrifically accident-prone steeplejack. There seems to be an accident-prone steeplejack involved in some of those stories. I think this picture is especially important, and I want you to realize how difficult it was to get to obtain this particular picture. Certainly, if the Basilica has been the venue for sacred assembly, then Washington Hall has served the vital complementary role for secular assembly in the heart of the historic campus. When I first visited the campus in 1984, I walked into a Washington Hall auditorium that looked essentially the same as it had since the 1950s. The painted interior, sort of tastefully executed with minimal decoration, had been central to Father Arthur S. Harvey's 1956 modernization plan. Some of you may recall Father Art even from those days. And almost no one alive today can remember any interior but this modern one, of course, which is very interesting to think about how long ago that was when the change was occurred. But as a result, few of us know that Father Harvey approved the painting over of this elaborate 1894 interior executed by the same artists whose efforts on the Basilica and the main building have now been painstakingly restored. By the commencement of 1894, the newly completed interior of Washington Hall contained complex emblematic paintings and portraits that covered its every surface, as we can see from this picture. This is about the only really good, excellent, surviving photograph we have from that period. Sadly, you all may recall, of course, looking up in the Basilica, as Peter mentioned, where we see the work of those same two artists, beautiful paint murals and paintings and decorations, and of course also inside the Golden Dome itself. We know that the interior was done and how beautiful that was in that restoration of the main building, which was done just not so long ago. And of course, we know in the main building corridor, you can't walk down the main building corridor and not see the murals paying homage to Columbus. And there are a series of them, and they're so important that they were even used, as we all know, as the template for that first U.S. commemorative stamp series. So they're very important and very significant to the artistic heritage and legacy of this campus, certainly. So when I wrote about the Gregori Ruska interior of 1894 in my book, I wrote it all up in about 8 pages, and I had 7 illustrations, so I thought it was pretty complete. But I tell you, I have to admit now, I'll just admit it to this crowd, we won't let it outside the room, that I really had no idea what the specific contribution of each artist was, although I assumed that both men were here on campus. Exclamation, question mark, uh-oh. You can already see the problem, I think. But what did each man do? We know that that whole interior that I showed you earlier was totally done and beautifully done, but we really didn't know exactly who did what. And it was kind of interesting to try to figure out what that might be. Certainly in contemporary scholastic articles of the time, both men received high praise for the interior. And I knew from the financial records in the archives, which of course I have a lot of experience as Bristol, as Peter mentions, with the Bristol volume, going over records and going over that kind of thing, I knew from the financial records in the archives that the university had paid both men for work done in Washington Hall during this period of time. In fact, here we go. This bores people to death, but I have to show it to you. Here are the financial records where we see Gregori is receiving June 28, 1894. He received $400, a single payment, in late June of 1894. Very soon after the completion of the interior, and Ruska was paid a total of about $800. He gets 100 here, 125 here, 245 here. They spell his name in a strange way, and then of course $367.50. All that's being paid, a total of almost $800 for his work from late March to the middle of July. But what did each do specifically to receive these payments? Now, it's important, I think, let's just do this for a second. I always insist that students translate dollars into modern dollars because it means nothing if you just talk about $400. Depending on how you want to look at $400, the payment that was received, in our dollars today, we're talking about around $10,000 using sort of normal amounts, normal equations. But there are also a lot of other things you can look at, as we know. But the point is, $400, that's a sizable chunk of money. That's like a $10,000 payment, and you can look at it from other perspectives and even see it as a much higher payment. So we're talking about a significant amount of money being paid to the artists to complete the interior of Washington Hall in 1894. So we're putting that in that proper perspective. So certainly also when I was researching my book and writing it, and it took from 2003 to 2009, these things always take longer than you think they will. I don't know why it takes so long to do these things, but of course I had been in touch with people in the Snite who were working on the artist in residence, the working drawings, and that was Sophia Myers, who got her MA in 2010 in art history, and of course her advisor was Dr. Coleman in the art department who had helped her with that. We had all been in touch, and they knew what I was working on, and indeed Coleman cited me in his preface to this catalog. He cited my book, and he noted that there was a connection between Gregori and Washington Hall, but again, we weren't sure exactly who had done what. So all of us knew what was going on. We knew that there was this tie-in, but again, we weren't quite sure exactly who had done what. Uh-oh, here we go. Here's where the I can't say what I want to say in this crowd, but here's where certain matters hits flying objects, and we have Myers almost casually mentioned. Bless her heart. Don't you love these graduate students? Myers just almost casually mentioned in her exhibition catalog that Gregori was not in this country in 1894 when the interior was completed. Uh-oh. Something maybe I had missed or ignored? We hate to say that, don't we? How then did he paint the interior? What was his contribution? One that was clearly worth $400, $10,000. That's a lot of money to be paid to him. I had just assumed he was on site. Big mistake, but that was not the case. His last visit to the United States occurred in the fall of 1893, before the interior was even done. I found out later after I looked into this, of course. Oh my goodness, or I think we have OMG or something like that we write on our Facebook pages now, on our Twitter accounts and things like that. So there was absolutely nothing, though, in the Snite exhibition which focused on his working drawings seemed to relate Gregori to Washington Hall. Professor Coleman and Dr. Cheryl Snay, who is the curator of European art here at the Snite, we all three spent a long time, hours and hours, going through multiple boxes of miscellaneous drawings to verify that no smoking gun existed, even though it was likely that any working drawings that were connected to Washington Hall would have probably stayed with Gregori in Florence. His working drawings would have been with him. They would not probably have been here, since now we know he wasn't here. He was in Italy the whole time this was being done. Now, we also knew from other sources that he had sent completed paintings directly to the United States from Europe, as was the case with the 1893 World's Fair Columbia Exposition. Perhaps he did something similar with regard to Washington Hall. So we're starting to figure out a little bit more as to maybe what was really going on here. Okay, it was time to go back to the archives. It's always time to go back to the archives. It's always fun to spend time in the archives. So any excuse I can have to go back to the archives, I'm happy to do that. But it was indeed time to go back to the archives to try to learn more about his precise contribution to this 1894 interior, especially in relation to Louis Ruska, who clearly was on campus painting in the spring of 1894 when he was not. And because contemporary scholastic articles credited the sumptuous interior to both artists, the articles talk about them both as though they're both there and doing all this, it seems likely that they both played important roles, clearly. Okay, who had done what? How had they done it? And how had it happened with our favorite Notre Dame Vatican artist in Florence during this time? How had this happened? I found, by going back to the archives, I found that Francesca Fanny Gregori, his daughter, who spoke and wrote English, and he, of course, did not, she was in touch with James Edwards. James Edwards is sometimes credited, a professor credited with being our kind of father of the archives and very much involved in those kind of things very early on. She wrote him a series of letters in 1894 in which nothing is ever mentioned regarding Washington Hall. But look what she says right here. She says, yesterday, as we sent word to Reverend Father Morrissey was president of Notre Dame at that time, we shipped 9 of the pictures, namely the 4 sitting figures, the 4 portraits, and the portrait of Washington. They will leave on the 5th of May. There we've got it. April 27th, 1894. And she gave instructions in that same letter for preparing the Washington Hall walls and ceiling in anticipation of the installation of the canvas paintings, again, without ever specifically mentioning Washington Hall, which is why these never popped up in any kind of indexing or cataloging. It's why we always have to go and look at everything, and you can't go by indexing and cataloging because it may not show anything, it may not pop up. And she says here, my father is going to write a few lines of explanation to Mr. Ruska, probably in Italian to Ruska, because he would write in Italian to him. In that letter we have not found, about the placing of the pictures. While waiting for the pictures, he might varnish the wall in order that it will not absorb when the white paint is put on to attach the pictures. couldn't be more specific, and it's wonderful. And then she adds, she cautioned Ruska via Edwards again with regard to the installation of the large canvases. These canvases are like 4 feet by 12 feet. These are huge, huge paintings. She says, great care must also be taken in handling them because any folding or crushing will cause the color to scale off. The raising of them to put them to the ceiling must be done very exactly, and good many persons must hold them up. It's wonderful to see all this specific instructions about what's going to be happening here. So it means then that we've got canvases being painted in Florence, and the canvases are going to be shipped here, and they're going to be installed by Ruska once they get here. So now, another thing, the original plan, which is described in the Scholastic as late as April 1894, called for portraits of Shakespeare, Moliere, Dante, and Mozart. We've got Shakespeare complemented by tragedy, and here's Shakespeare. I'll show you a blow-up in a minute. Complemented by tragedy. This is actually the ceiling, so Shakespeare's on the ceiling. This is on the wall going up to the ceiling. Moliere, complemented by comedy. I think Dante, complemented by poetry, my guess. And Mozart, complemented by music in the back of the house, back behind where you would be, back in those corners of the house. Now, of the very interesting thing that happened here, though, something kind of interesting happened with the original plan, and here's an actual transcript from her letter. Fanny, who was with her father daily in his studio in Florence, referred exclusively, however, to Beethoven rather than to Dante when she wrote about the portraits. We may never know why he made a change that would have compromised the planned complementarity of great personage to muse-like personification, but indeed that's what appears to happen. Fanny's letter here that I'm showing you to James Edwards makes it clear that her father painted Beethoven rather than Dante, and all subsequent scholastic articles always referred to Beethoven and not Dante. And she says here, my father has already painted the 4 bust portraits and Washington picture and is now working on the first 2 of the sitting figures. The 4 portraits are Shakespeare, Moliere, Beethoven, Mozart. We think of sending them pictures in as soon as they're finished. No word about Dante at all. So very interesting. So we end up then with this interior. We end up with an interior that for some reason we really have strong indication that we never got the Dante portrait, and for some reason we got Beethoven instead. I think Ruska really does deserve a great deal of credit here because he and his crew, including his right-hand man Palagano, we don't know anything about Palagano, at least I haven't found anything yet. We may know things, but it's stored away somewhere. Clearly, he clearly got the venue fully prepared so that the 2 shipments of paintings could be quickly and efficiently installed the instant they arrived. And because it seems to me that we have to remember that this whole interior was ready by the June 1894 commencement. These paintings are not being shipped until the end of May. So everything had to be done in Washington Hall except where those 11 portraits were going to go, and they had to be installed within a 2-week period. And of course, 9 of those involve extensive scaffolding. So let's take a closer look. You can see the scaffolding. You can imagine the scaffolding over the proscenium arch you would have to have in place to install Washington, to install Shakespeare, to install tragedy, and of course, only the classical orators right and left of the proscenium arch would you not have to have scaffolding. So let's look at these closer up and see what we can find out about them. Here's the one of George Washington in Washington Hall. On the proscenium arch itself and centered above the stage, the portrait of George Washington, namesake of the building. And I actually talk about in my book extensively about how for Father Soren, Washington Hall, the original Washington Hall was built in 1862. It was a different building. And the idea of tying in this campus to the father of the country and love of God and country, and to be a good American and being a good Catholic, it was the same thing. There is no line between the two. They are inextricable, and having a building, your major communal assembly building named after the father of the country, was so important to Father Soren, who dedicated the first Washington Hall in 1864, just 2 years after the actual structure went up. Not this one, but the earlier version. But here you have above the stage George Washington, namesake of the building, father of the country, holding the Declaration of Independence in his hand, surrounded by Pro Deo et Patria, for God God and country, a pluribus unum, from many one. And this portrait then, we know now, this canvas portrait, canvas, not a mural, the canvas portrait shipped from Florence was done by, of course, Gregori. And everything else you see around here by Ruska. He did everything else, got everything else ready. That's the Washington mural portrait. And then, of course, here's tragedy up close. You can see tragedy in her niche and this personification of tragedy. The portrait, again, would have been all, this part would have been shipped over and applied to the wall, and all the framing, all this trompe l'oeil. This looks like it, looks like it's three-dimensional, but of course we know better from the main building. We know how tricksy that can be, how you can do those wonderful things, and that was so popular at the time. All of this is Ruska doing all of this around tragedy. And of course, right above tragedy, of course, you would expect to see Shakespeare. This looks distorted because Shakespeare's on the ceiling and the angle of the picture is wrong. But if you were right under it, it would not appear this distorted, I'm sure. We've got, of course, Shakespeare, but this would have been done by our artist in Florence. And of course, everything else, Ruska is doing all of the other decoration, all the extensive decoration, which he would have completed before those portraits, I think, even would have arrived from, in fact, Florence. And then, of course, we have very little information on other parts of the building, but we do have in the earliest surviving photograph from the 1916 Dome, we have, this is our earliest surviving photograph of a film audience, an audience, what it would be like if you were the screen looking at the audience of people watching a film in Washington Hall. We know films were screened there as early as 1914, maybe, or even 1913, but certainly by 1915, 16, they were screening Birth of a Nation, everything, all the great films were being shown there. But the point here is that we, for our purposes, for this discussion today, probably this is music back here. Probably Mozart was above there, although we don't know for sure. And then probably this looks like poetry. It seems to me if we look on a close-up, you can't tell. It's hard to tell here. This person seems to, this personification seems to have a musical instrument in her hands. And over here we seem to have some kind of writing instrument and some kind of a tablet and poetry. And that's where Dante, excuse me, we didn't get Dante, did we? That's where Beethoven would have been. So it's kind of an interesting thing, but that's the only, but everything else is by Ruska. All the decoration that you see, everything else, Ruska Palagano and the workmen would have taken care of that and gotten all that readied in the months before the paintings arrived from Florence. Now, I did want to go in for a close-up on the proscenium arch itself to show you these last two portraits that were shipped, and these are our trompe l'oeil statues of the classical orators Demosthenes and Cicero. You've got one Greek and one Roman. And it's so wonderful that they would be there. Then, stay on the proscenium left and proscenium right, stage left, stage right, or house right and house left. And the idea of having the orators right there on the proscenium for this whole period. And Fanny made it clear that in fact, Ruska should not hold up his work as a result of the second later shipment. These came later because these classical orators, she said, since they're going to be placed at eye level, they require no scaffolding. And therefore, you can just pop those babies in no time at all. That's not going to be any time at all. We think they probably applied them the way we would apply wallpaper today. We think something like that may have been the process that would have been used for these canvas. But she does say this. She does tell James Edwards, she says, her father wants the statues done in such a way that the light must seem as coming from the center. In other words, that luminescent quality. And I think we get some of that luminescent quality here with in this statue. And notice all this faux marble work along here, all this marbling and grainer. The people who did this were called grainers. They did this with doors. You'll see the doors in the main building that have been grained up the third, fourth, and fourth floor. They look like they're real fancy schmancy wood, some kind of special, French special burl oak or something like that, and they're not. They were just cheap, well, not cheap now, but at the time, plain wood that they were able to grain in such a way to make it look like something really fancy. Certainly George Washington at Mount Vernon did this kind of thing too. If you've seen Mount Vernon on the outside, he made it look like it's made out of stone when in fact it's made out of wood. That was a very popular thing to do in the 18th and well into the 19th century, certainly. I also, though, wanted to show you that proscenium arch. It's kind of hard, again, with these blow-ups. You can't see all this as well as you can with higher definition. But the fact that this proscenium arch, this is very close. Here's where Demosthenes would be right here if we had a larger picture. But this is all Ruska. And it looks like just a hodgepodge of foliage and things like that, but it's not. What's so important here is there's great emblematic artistry here, a sense of design. It's all tied in. So here it says Girac, one of the founders of the music program at Notre Dame. Long gone, but back to the very beginning, 1840s, 1850s. And then you can't really see it here, but you've got Rossini written in there. The name is written in there, and you've got Balfe written in there. And on the other side, you've got Haydn, and you've got Gounod, so you've got this, and intertwined here, you've got all these music notes and books and words and all these kinds of things. So it's this tremendously powerful intertwining message of all the great composers, the great European composers from different countries, Germany, and Ireland, in France and so forth at the time, at Italy, all there, all on the foundation of the two founders of the music programs at Notre Dame. So you've got the founders of the music program, you've got the great classical orators, you've got the great playwrights, the great musicians. This space is doing it all. It's the place where all these things happen, not just theater. Of course, we in theater think that's all you need, but there are other people out there who insist on things like music and oratory and these various things. And so this space was this wonderful, wonderful space where, in fact, all of these things could, in fact, and did, in fact, happen. Okay, so I think Swiss-Italian fresco artist and church decorator Louis Ruska, who we know immigrated as a young man to the United States in 1866 and worked first in Kansas City before having his own Chicago company, I think he deserves a great deal of credit here too, because he clearly got that venue fully prepared in the March to May 1894 period, so that when the paintings arrived from Florence, they could, in fact, really go up quickly. And here I kind of have listed here what we know then. Who did what? We know the 11 pictures that we've talked about. We know exactly what was done and what was done in Florence and shipped over, and then we know everything Ruska did, of course, all the various things that he did, and of course everything all around. So we really do, a year later, have a much better view as to what was actually done and how it would have been applied. All of Ruska's work would have been painted directly on the walls. We can call them frescoes, but we don't really think they were doing a real fresco system. But there's discussion on that. But the idea whether it's wet plaster fresco or whether it's just painted walls, we're not sure, but we'll call it fresco or murals. But then in that, you've got the actual 11 canvas portraits and painters from Italy that are then applied in their special spots and their special places. So we know for over 60 years then, from 1894 until 1956, audiences seated in the Washington Hall Auditorium saw a proscenium arch that included the surnames of the great patriarchs, the trompe-l'oeil statues of great orators, all these kinds of things. All this was constantly reaffirming in the sense of ideology being reflected physically, this physical manifestation of ideology through all the names and the people and the personages, all of whom were very important to what was going on in that space during that time. And, of course, the whole subjective artistic evaluation thing aside, we're not talking about the quality of the art here necessarily, but this physical manifestation of the ideology of the space is just so incredibly important, and again, under the watchful eye of the father of the country. We are Americans. This is George Washington oversees all of this. He is affirming all of this, and the space is named after him. We are good Americans, very good Americans, as we're also good Catholics, which, as we know, the history of those early years in the 19th century of the university, there were some pretty tough times with some of those issues, as we all know. And the whole idea that this is an aesthetic confirmation that Washington Hall is the center of secular communal assembly on a Notre Dame campus where God and country were just absolutely inseparable. And that's something that I think that space very strongly said when it was the way that it was from 1894 until 1956. Now, audiences during the period that we had this wonderful interior, they of course heard fiery speeches by Williams Jennings Bryan, and they heard lectures by G.K. Chesterton. They saw films, I already mentioned Birth of a Nation, and of course Knut Rockne, All American, and they were projected from the back of the house onto a screen set up on the stage. They attended full-fledged minstrel shows, and of course later iterations of things like Monogram Absurdities, which we have modern versions, the Keenan Review. Has that been banned totally, by the way? Anyway, we used to have the Keenan Review around here, that kind of thing. And of course a long tradition in this space of course men like Rockne playing women's roles before women played those roles exclusively, a long tradition of that. We certainly, audiences in this space experienced some of the greatest performers in the nation, from the premier acting troupe of the day, Augustin Daly's comedy, a company of comedians, to avant-garde. One of the last performances in this space was Merce Cunningham. Some of you may have seen Merce Cunningham's dancers last year in the new DPAC. They performed in 1956. The last performance in this space before it was redone was Merce Cunningham, his dancers, with, of course, composer John Cage at the very peak of their talents. So audiences saw puppet shows, they saw scientific exhibitions, they saw travelogues, all this under the watchful eye of the father of the country, and all with this supportive cast of painted characters against this highly decorated background. It must have been marvelous indeed. Now, the modernization of the interior of Washington Hall in 1956 almost certainly destroyed all 11 of Gregori's campuses. But Ruska's work likely remains under coats of paint. And whatever Ruska's precise installation method may have been in 1894, the canvases would have almost certainly been removed utterly by tried and true scraping and sanding procedures used by workmen in 1956 to prepare the walls and the ceiling for Father Harvey's two tones of gray. He has these wonderful gray tones, Persian gray and some other kind of gray. He loved gray, and he had the two tones of paint. Now we have, it's still pretty monochromatic, but it's not gray anymore, but it might as well be. So for the last 62 years then, no audience member in Washington Hall has looked up at the proscenium arch to glimpse this imposing George Washington. And since the summer of 1956, no one has viewed the seated personifications of tragedy, comedy, and poetry and music with the adjacent portraits of Shakespeare, Moliere, Beethoven, and Mozart, all being overseen by the great classical orators. That just hasn't happened. All that has been gone since that time and has been now hidden under these layers and layers of paint. I guess I should ask this question: is it time to bring all this back? I mean, is it time for the? Some of you saw me going there. Is it time for the? Is it time? You can write checks at the end of this. I think big checks. I think we're talking big checks here. Is it time for the university to restore Washington Hall's interior, its Gregori Ruska interior of 1894? We've already done that in both the Basilica and the main building. And of course other institutions around the country have done this same kind of restoration of original artwork in their buildings. And I think probably that the 1894 interior, once restored, would both complement the artistry we see today in the Basilica and the main building and reaffirm the university's larger artistic vision for the central campus's most historic buildings. Perhaps it is indeed time to make Notre Dame's first performing arts center once again, as the Scholastic effusively proclaimed in June of 1894, this gem, this perfect hall for public entertainments. So this is how scholarship works. We win some, we lose some. The more we learn, the more we realize we don't know. But the more we find out, and the more we find out, the more we find out we don't know as much as we thought we found out. Or what we found out doesn't turn out to always give us all the answers. It's an ongoing process. It's an interim report. All research is an interim report. This is an interim report, as all publications are. But the fun of it is that no sooner do we get these things out than we start to find, oh, well, there are nuances here. There are things we didn't know, there are things to find out, and it gives us a great chance to find out even more. So I'm just so happy today to have been able to share this process with you, the process of the scholar, the ongoing process. I'm embarrassed that I didn't realize that, of course, the great Vatican artist was back in Italy in 1894, but I only make actually one glaring error in the book that I've got it just by changing a word. But other than that, it's I pretty well finessed it, because we didn't really know at the time what he precisely had done and what Ruska precisely had done. So I think now maybe it'd be good to turn things over to questions or insights or reflections, perhaps. Thank you. I wasn't trying to bring that screen up. It's very PowerPoint can be very naughty sometimes and do things you don't intend. Are there any questions or insights? Yes.
There were rumors years ago, and maybe it was about the 80s, and I don't know if there were leaks or what the problem was, but there were rumors that the university was going to tear down Washington Hall. And I guess the question is, one, do you think now the university recognizes that it is part of, quote, the Holy Trinity or Triad, right, or Troika?
Triad, Troika, Triumvirate, whatever we want to call it.
So will it be, finally put back where it needs to be, and could we actually restore it back to where it was in 1894?
Sure. As horrifying as this question is, there are plans in the 60s, 1960s, this is 56 when this was done, and we know the modernization period continued, well into the 60s. There were plans into the 60s to do the same thing with the main building, preserving only the dome, and to take out, the main building was, come on, folks, you remember what the main building was like before it was restored. It was a mess. It was a mess. It was falling down. Nobody will admit that, but we know it was. And so we put how much into it? $50 million, some huge amount of money to restore it. But there were actually plans in the 60s to take out the main building and only preserve the dome and have right where the main building is just a kind of a statue, a dome, a statue, and nothing else. Kind of a shrine to where the main building had been. And that's when these buildings, Grace and Flanner and all those kind of buildings, the modern period, that whole new modern campus was going to go up. Now, in 1989, I think that Central District was declared an historic district. So those at least those three buildings, and there's some others like Soren Hall, that first dorm, some other very historic building, the Science Hall, which is now the Student Center. It's called La Fortune now, but that's the original the second science building, but the first real science building, and they can't be changed. The three buildings, the Basilica main building and Washington Hall, their footprints can't be changed. So their exteriors are now protected historically, and so that's likely that it's very unlikely that they would ever do anything to Washington Hall in terms of its exterior now. But there was that period when it certainly could have happened, and it's really interesting to think about how we go through these changes in our culture where we value different things at different times. Now, the problem you bring up is fun about what to restore. There were no interior bathrooms for audiences in Washington Hall until 1956. 1956, you had to go at intermission, go over to the Student Center to use the bathroom. There was one single toilet back in the back, and then one upstairs, before that period. So we don't want to go back to no elevators. We have ADA laws and rules now. You've got to have ADA compliance. That's a problem with old buildings. You know that. When you go and remodel, you can't remodel and save the old pre-ADA stuff. You've got to correct all that. Air conditioning. We only air condition the building. I'm trying to think, 86 maybe, it's in here, 86, 87 is when we finally got it air conditioned. You can imagine how pleasant it was in the summers before that time. So you have to think about that, because I think when the main building was modern, when they restored the main building, they lost 20% of the floor space to the mechanical rooms, air conditioning, venting, elevators, all those things. 20% of the space of the main building was gobbled up. You in your own homes know you have places where you have things like furnaces and hot water heaters and all these kinds of things that take up space, but that it's not space you can actually live in. And that's one of the problems. So, and also back in the audience there, back where the audience is, where we had Beethoven and Mozart, and not Dante, those have been cut out for 50 years now for lighting instruments to shine onto the stage. So do you go back and do you restore those? So it's a huge question. It would take a committee of people to get together and really figure out what do we want to restore and how do we want to do it. Or even the outside stairs. The outside stairs used to come up to the second floor, like the main building. I mean, that didn't happen. That didn't change until, 1936. They took off those stairs, and now you come in at the lower level and you go upstairs that are inside the building on the south entrance. It wasn't that way from 1882 until 1936. So, interesting question. Yeah. Who else has a question or an insight or a thought? Yes?
In the late 60s, early 70s, the foundation for Sacred Heart was crumbling, and there was thought that would have to be demolished.
Yes.
A new church.
Yes, yes. Our whole modern notion, we have to remember, the whole culture, the 50s and 60s, were going modern. And we tore down all of our, how many cities lost all their 1890s townhouses and urban renewal, and we just went through and just did all kinds of things, didn't we? Because the idea we wanted to go modern and everything from the past. We lowered ceilings, we got rid of fireplaces, we did all these things, took all the charm out of what we would now call charm. And now in the postmodern period, or the post-postmodern period, or the post-Toasties period, as I teach my students, we always teach the post-Toasties period, but in the post-postmodern, post-Toasties period, we now, of course, have respect for all earlier periods and are interested in all these kinds of things. And so some of you even will redecorate your home and put in something that especially has charm. You'll pay for charm. You'll pay for some Victorian something, some kind of picket fence or something that's highly impractical, but you will do that because we're into that. So we kind of got through that period. But yes, there was a real modern period there when all over the country, not just here, we were tearing things down. But you're right about the church, the main building, and of course Washington Hall. Yes?
None of the Gregori artwork is there. None of that is behind that painting.
We actually don't know. We don't really know. If he had been here, boy, I love counterfactual history, don't you? Had he been here and painted them the way Ruska did, I think they would be there. But I think because they were actual canvases, I think it's highly unlikely that they're there. And so this would be an argument for the bean counters who don't want to spend a lot of money on that building to restore it. They'd say we can't possibly ever find anything original. Now, the argument there is that they had to do, in the main building, they had to recreate an awful lot of stuff there too. But yes, one of the sad things is that don't you think the canvases were probably scraped off and sanded down? I can't imagine, I don't know, I can't imagine, I mean, I guess you could plaster over them and paint over them, but it would seem to me that we know, if you had wallpaper on a wall, would you paint over the wallpaper or would you remove the wallpaper and sand it down and paint? I think that answers the question. Most of us would get rid of the old wallpaper. So sadly, I have a very strong feeling that maybe they're just not there, but I think a lot. You could still, it wouldn't be it would be a restoration. It'd be a reproduction. It would not be a restoration, it would be a reproduction. It'd be like, you could reproduce. And we've done this in the historic theme parks all over the country. There are buildings in Williamsburg, Virginia that never existed. Half of Europe after World War II was utterly rebuilt. And you go to Warsaw or something, and you think there's these 18th century buildings, and I'm sorry, they were all totally rebuilt from rubble. We know that. The Royal Crescent at Bath, all these things, we know tremendous restoration can occur if you want to do it. So, we'll see. Yeah. Any other questions? Yes.
This is not passing an aesthetic judgment, but I've often heard about how the naming of Washington Wall by Soren was a sign of 19th century Catholic insecurity as in the place in American life, under the criticisms of the know-nothings and people like this, and the placing of a picture of Washington looking over was again some evidence of some insecurity about how their level of acceptance in American life. I wonder if you think of the painting over and removal of it as a sign of greater.
Sure. Yeah, because if you think about 56, of course we didn't elect John Kennedy until 1960. So, but the strong argument is that that issue wasn't really solved in America until Kennedy was elected president. That's when finally it was like, oh, okay, no insecurity anymore, not an issue, not a problem. But it took that long. One could argue. I mean, you can argue different ways, but you certainly could say that. I think it's certainly that's a very good point, Frank, and I think that's a great idea. I think it's also true. You have to remember Father Harvey. Some of you, anybody know Father Art Harvey in here? He wanted that building to be the theater building, didn't he? He wanted a modern theater that was like theaters he attended on Broadway and the West End in London and so forth. And he wanted it to be, there was a territoriality thing with that. He wanted that to be the theater building. And I think one thing by painting over everything and taking out all those distractions is it was a real powerful statement of ownership. And he, of course, did everything he could during his very successful years as head of the theater, of the university theater, to really maintain as much control of that space as he possibly could. The problem is it was the only assembly hall on campus. Well, there was like the Navy drill hall and places like that, but the only real assembly hall, and so there was that constant competition, wasn't there, for space, and so he was always fighting battles, as we did in '84 when I came. We were constantly having to deal with, somebody coming in and wanting to talk and all these various things. So yeah, that's a very real problem. But it's certainly, everything was painted over. They painted over everything. But yeah, there was great insecurity. It's very hard to remember about a time when Roman Catholics in this country had, that tremendous insecurity and that tremendous sense of being the other and not being welcomed and treated badly and all those kinds of things. It's very hard now with the great success of American Catholics to even think about a time when those things were real issues, but clearly they were. The Klan riots in the 20s, I talk about the Ku Klux Klan riots in the 20s in South Bend. One of the problems with the Klan riots was, of course, is that Catholics were targeted by the Klan just as African Americans were. Catholics to the Klan were as bad as African Americans. And so our students who didn't live on campus then, they lived off campus, were caught up in all these terrible things going on with the Klan that had a headquarters building right downtown with a big red cross and lights that blinked like a flaming cross all night long. It was down there. And so our students were involved in riots and fights and all this stuff because they, of course, were caught up in that same anti-Klan mentality as African Americans during that period. So even as late as 1920, 24, is that when the Klan riots occurred? In 1924, you've still got tremendous anti-Catholicism, right here in South Bend. And that's when they decided to build dorms, bring all the kids, bring all the men here, build the wall, bring them all in, get enough dorms so nobody has to live in boarding houses and all those things downtown where they're being threatened and not safe. So that's an interesting little historical side note. Yes? Do we have
research, painstaking research, days, not hours, in the archives, going through box after box of papers, has the effect of just making us look at things afresh. Every time you might now wander into Washington Hall, you'll see it as a very different space. You'll imagine those Gregori paintings and the Ruska decoration now over the walls. I think that Mark exemplifies for me what wonderful archival scholarship does. It just makes us look at the world in a totally different way. Thank you, Mark.
Thank you so much. Thank you.